In March of 1938, Jackson was appointed Solicitor General. In that advocate's position, which he loved, Jackson argued and won many cases for the government before the Supreme Court. In fact, Justice Louis Brandeis said Jackson should be Solicitor General for life. In 1940, President Roosevelt appointed Jackson U.S. Attorney General. One of his assignments was to advise the President whether he had the authority, without seeking the approval of Congress, to conclude an executive agreement with Great Britain. The United States proposed transferring to the British 50 overage destroyers, which England desperately needed to combat the Germans, in exchange for naval and air bases on the British possessions in the Western Hemisphere. Jackson's favorable opinion provided a strong underpinning for that vital transaction. Frequently during this time period, Jackson would come home to the Jamestown area and enjoy family and friends. President Roosevelt had informed Jackson of his plan to appoint him Chief Justice when Charles Evans Hughes retired. However, when that event occurred, the three of them agreed that it would be best for the court and for Jackson if he were to serve first as an Associate Justice under Harlan Fiske Stone, who was then elevated to Chief Justice. Jackson was appointed June 12, 1941, and was confirmed by the Senate July 7th. During Jackson's 13 years of service on the high bench, he delivered 148 opinions for the court, 46 concurrences, and 115 dissents. As the Supreme Court Biographical booklet states, his style was clear, direct, and persuasive, so that his opinions were easily understood. And occasionally they would be punctuated by sarcasm or cynicism, and sometimes spiced with humor. Quote, "We are not final because we are infallible, but we are infallible because we are final," he once said about the court. As a sidelight, when Justice Jackson took up offices in the Supreme Court building in Washington, there was an element of home to greet him. Much of the furniture in the Supreme Court building was manufactured by Jamestown Royal Upholstery Company of Jamestown, New York. In April 1945, Justice Jackson acceded to President Truman's request that he become Chief U.S. Prosecutor against the leaders of Nazi Germany for their wars of aggression and war crimes and the atrocities they ordered or permitted. During his leave of absence from the Supreme Court, Jackson set up an office in Paris, assembled a staff, and prepared, in cooperation with the Allies, the prosecution of 20 Nazi war criminals. Jackson gave the opening statement for the prosecution on November 21st, 1945, at Nuremberg, Germany. On October 1st, 1946, the International Military Tribunal met for the last time to sentence the guilty defendants. Jackson believed that the long months at Nuremberg were well spent in the most important, enduring, and constructive work of my life. After the trial, President Truman awarded Justice Jackson the Medal of Merit because of extraordinary fidelity and exceptionally meritorious conduct as prosecutor. Jackson explained the new theory of international law as follows: "No longer may the head of a state consider himself outside the law and impose inhuman acts on the peoples of the world." Jackson returned to the court in 1946 and participated until his death in 1954. One of the most meaningful cases was the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer case, also known as the Steel seizure case, which invalidated President Truman's attempted seizure of private steel mills during the Korean War to prevent a strike. Again, the Supreme Court booklet cited Jackson produced a thoughtful explanation of the basic constitutional doctrine of separation of powers that the court found helpful in the Watergate cases many years later. Justice Jackson suffered a heart attack on March 30th, 1954, and was advised that he could look forward to a relatively long life if he curtailed his activities, but that a continuation would represent a risk of death at almost any time. He characteristically chose the latter course and left the hospital on May 17th to be on the bench when the court's unanimous anti-segregation decision in Brown v. Board of Education was announced. The Monday edition of the Post-Journal announced the death of Robert Jackson and further announced the plans concerning the returning home of Robert Jackson to his native Jamestown and Frewsburg. Robert H. Jackson died October 9th, 1954, of a heart attack. A funeral was held in Washington, D.C., and on Wednesday, October 13th, 1954, his remains were brought to Jamestown and lay in state at St. Luke's Church, where the funeral was held that afternoon with burial in the Maple Grove Cemetery, Frewsburg, New York. There were many editorials. The Jamestown Post-Journal of October 11, 1954 stated, "The nation mourns a great statesman and jurist in the death on Saturday of Justice Robert H. Jackson of the United States Supreme Court. But we in Jamestown, who have had the privilege to call him friend and neighbor, feel an even deeper grief and loss in the death of Bob Jackson. He was no less the great statesman and jurist to us, but even more, he was a man of homely character, true sincerity, wonderful friendliness, and honest humility." On that same day in Washington, Chief Justice Earl Warren made these remarks at the opening of the session of court. After doing so, in respect to his memory, the court adjourned until Thursday, October 14th,